He did not choose to come here. He was taken, pulled from everything he had ever known. The stone streets of Jerusalem, the sound of Hebrew prayers at dawn, the smell of cedar oil in the temple courts. He was young, likely still a teenager, a noble's son from Judah. And now the roads behind him led to ruin. Ahead of him lay Babylon, not a rumor, not a name on a scroll, a real city. The largest city most people in the ancient world had ever heard of. A city of blue-glazed walls, iron discipline, languages from across the empire, and a king who had just brought Judah to its knees. The boy who would one day read the handwriting on a king's wall, who would survive a pit of lions, who would outlive an empire. That boy was walking into Babylon for the first time, and he had no reason to believe he would ever walk out. This is his story, but it is also the story of Babylon itself. What it was, how it worked, why it was terrifying, and why it could not ultimately hold the man it tried to make. To understand Daniel, you have to understand the city that tried to own him. The year is approximately 605 BC. Nebuchadnezzar II, king of Babylon, has just defeated the Egyptian army at the Battle of Carchemish. His reach now extends across the ancient Near East, and Judah, the small kingdom in the southern highlands of Canaan, is directly in his path. The book of 2 Kings describes what happened next. Nebuchadnezzar came to Jerusalem. He besieged it. King Jehoiakim of Judah submitted, and Nebuchadnezzar took treasures from the temple of God in Jerusalem and brought them to Babylon. He also took people, specifically young men from the royal family and nobility of Judah, educated, healthy, intelligent, useful. This was the beginning of Babylonian domination over Judah. Not yet the final destruction that would come later, but the first sharp blow. The city still stood, but something had been taken from it that could not easily be returned. The prophet Jeremiah had warned that this was coming. He called it judgment, the consequence of decades of unfaithfulness, of turning from God, of ignoring the warnings of prophets. But knowing the reason did not ease the weight of the moment. Entire families were torn apart. Jerusalem was left weakened and diminished, and a group of young Judean nobles began a journey they had not asked for. The road from Jerusalem to Babylon was roughly 900 miles. Travelers could not go straight east across the Arabian desert. There was no water. They followed the ancient trade routes north through Syria, and then southeast down the Euphrates River Valley into Mesopotamia. The journey likely took several weeks, possibly longer, on foot or by caravan, through desert heat, through foreign landscapes, past cities with names and languages they did not know. We do not know exactly what Daniel saw or felt during that journey. Scripture does not tell us. But we can say this: every mile was a mile further from home, from the temple, from everything that had told him who he was. And at the end of that road was a city that intended to tell him something different. The first sight of Babylon would have been striking even from a distance. Ancient Babylon sat on the Euphrates River in what is now central Iraq, roughly 60 miles south of modern Baghdad. The city had been rebuilt by Nebuchadnezzar on a scale that was nearly unimaginable for the ancient world. Ancient sources and later Greek historians described outer walls stretching for miles around the city, wide enough, some said, for chariots to pass each other on top. Historians treat those ancient measurements carefully. Some descriptions were likely exaggerated, and not all of them can be confirmed by modern archaeology. But even conservative estimates based on actual excavations suggest the city was enormous, covering several square miles, divided by the Euphrates, connected by bridges, and fortified by multiple layers of walls and moats. When German archaeologist Robert Koldewey began excavating Babylon between 1899 and 1917, he uncovered the physical foundations of what the biblical writers described: real bricks, real foundations, a real city of extraordinary scale and ambition. And at the entrance to the inner city stood something that no visitor could forget: the Ishtar Gate. The gate, dedicated to the Babylonian goddess Ishtar, was rebuilt by Nebuchadnezzar as a massive ceremonial entrance into the city. It was constructed from deep blue and turquoise glazed bricks, a color achieved through a complex firing process, and decorated with rows of animals in relief, bulls and dragons alternating in, yellow and white against that intense blue background. Koldewey excavated the original foundation and recovered thousands of glazed bricks. A reconstruction of the gate now stands in the Pergamon Museum in Berlin. Scholars continue to debate the exact original height and appearance, but the excavated evidence makes clear that the gate was monumental, designed not simply to control entry, but to overwhelm it. Beyond the Ishtar Gate stretched the processional way, a broad ceremonial road paved with limestone and flanked by walls also decorated with glazed brick reliefs of walking lions, the symbol of Ishtar. This road was used during the Babylonian New Year festival, the Akatu, when the statue of the god Marduk was carried in procession through the city. Soldiers marched here, temple officials processed here, and captives were brought through here, passing under the gaze of Babylon's gods before they ever reached the palace. For a young Jewish exile walking through that gate for the first time, the message was impossible to miss. This city did not belong to the God of Israel. This city belonged to Marduk, and Marduk, Babylon's king of the gods, had apparently just proven stronger than the God of Jerusalem. That was the imperial claim. That was what every brick, every gate, every lion on the wall was saying. And it was the first spiritual test Daniel would face. Before any furnace, before any lion's den, before any dream or vision. The test was simply this: when the empire tells you its gods won, do you believe it? Babylon was not merely a military power, it was a theological statement. The city itself was ancient, but Nebuchadnezzar had transformed it into something new. He was one of the great builders of the ancient world. Inscriptions from his reign record his massive construction projects, the rebuilding of temples, the fortification of walls, the construction of a new palace complex, the creation of the processional way. The ancient Greek historian Herodotus described Babylon with a kind of astonishment that was unusual even for a man who had seen many cities. Though some of his details have been questioned by scholars, his general portrait of a city of extraordinary wealth, complexity, and power aligns with what archaeology has confirmed. At the center of Babylon's religious life stood the Exile, the great temple complex dedicated to Marduk, Babylon's patron deity. Nearby rose the Etemenanki, a massive ziggurat, a stepped tower that some ancient writers described as reaching toward the heavens. Its exact height has been debated, but its foundation was excavated by Koldewey, and it was clearly a structure of enormous size. Some scholars have suggested this ziggurat may have influenced the biblical memory of the Tower of Babel. The connection is intriguing, but cannot be stated as certain. The temple district of Babylon was not a quiet, contemplative space. It was a complex of ritual activity, sacrifice, ceremony, music, and institutional power. A large body of priests and temple workers served these complexes. The king himself participated in annual religious rites. Religion and empire were not separate here. They were fused. For a young man raised on the Psalms of David, on the history of the Exodus, on the covenant promises of a God who could not be represented by any image, Babylon's religious world was not merely foreign. It was a direct challenge to everything he believed. But the test was more sophisticated than simple idol worship. And this is what made Babylon more dangerous than a battlefield. The book of Daniel, chapter 1, tells us exactly what Nebuchadnezzar ordered. The king commanded that certain young men be selected from the Israelite nobility, men who were physically healthy, intellectually sharp, quick to learn, and capable of serving in the royal court. They were to be trained for 3 years in the language and literature of the Babylonians. This was not imprisonment. It was something more insidious. It was education. Babylon's court was one of the most sophisticated intellectual environments in the ancient world. Babylonian scribes and scholars had developed advanced systems of mathematics, astronomy, medicine, and literature. They had libraries. They had centuries of accumulated wisdom. And Nebuchadnezzar wanted his best captives to learn all of it. The goal was transformation. The young men from Jerusalem were to be shaped into Babylonian officials. They would speak Babylonian Aramaic. They would read Babylonian texts. They would think in Babylonian categories. And they would be given new names. Daniel, whose name in Hebrew meant something like God is my judge, was renamed Belteshazzar, a name invoking the Babylonian god Bel. His companions received similar treatment. Hananiah became Shadrach, Mishael became Meshach, Azariah became Abednego. A name in the ancient world was not merely a label, it was an identity. It declared whose you were, who your God was, what lineage you carried. To rename someone was to attempt to overwrite them. Babylon was very good at this. And yet, and this is what the text makes quietly remarkable, Daniel and his companions did not resist the education. They entered the training. They learned the language. They engaged with Babylonian knowledge. The text gives no indication that they refused intellectual engagement with Babylonian culture. What they refused was something more specific. Daniel chapter 1 tells us that the young men were assigned royal food and wine from the king's table. This may seem like a minor detail, but it was not. For a young Jewish man, the king's food and wine likely presented a serious problem. Some of it may have been offered to Babylonian gods as part of temple ritual before it reached the table. Some of it likely violated the dietary laws that had shaped Jewish identity for generations. Daniel asked the official in charge of their training not to be excused from Babylon, not to be sent home, not to be given a different education, just to be excused from the king's food. He proposed a 10-day trial, vegetables and water. Let us see what happens. It was a quiet act, a private one, not a confrontation, not a public declaration, not a dramatic refusal. Just a young man in the middle of the most powerful empire on earth, asking to keep one small part of himself intact. That is the texture of Daniel's faithfulness. It was not loud, it was precise. And the text tells us that at the end of the 10 days, Daniel and his companions looked healthier than all the others. God honored the faithfulness in the small thing, and the official agreed to let them continue. But this was only the beginning. The training continued. 3 years as commanded. And at the end of those 3 years, when Nebuchadnezzar interviewed all the young men himself, Daniel and his 3 companions stood out. Sharper, wiser, more capable than anyone else in the group. The king found them 10 times better, the text says, than all the magicians and enchanters in his whole kingdom. An exile from Jerusalem had become one of the most valued minds in Babylon. The court of Nebuchadnezzar was not a safe place to be valuable. The king's inner circle included magicians, enchanters, sorcerers, and what Babylon called the Chaldeans, a special class of wise men, astrologers, and diviners who interpreted dreams and omens. These men occupied a dangerous position. Their role was to know things the king needed to know. When they couldn't deliver, the consequences could be severe. The second chapter of Daniel makes this starkly clear. Nebuchadnezzar had a dream that disturbed him, the kind of dream a powerful king could not simply set aside. He summoned his wise men and made an impossible demand. Not only interpret the dream, but first tell me what the dream was, without being told. When they could not, the king ordered the execution of all the wise men in Babylon. All of them, including Daniel and his companions, who had not even been present at the original meeting. This was the ordinary violence of imperial court life. A king's displeasure could mean death, and there was no appeal. Daniel was now inside a system where his survival depended on the favor of a man who had just ordered the death of an entire professional class. Daniel asked for time. He went home. He prayed with his companions. And that night, he says, God revealed the mystery to him in a vision. What Daniel described to Nebuchadnezzar was a vision of 4 great kingdoms, a statue of gold, silver, bronze, iron, and clay, and a stone cut without human hands that would one day crush all of them. The interpretation pointed toward the succession of empires across history, culminating in a kingdom established by God that would never end. Nebuchadnezzar was astonished. He fell on his face before Daniel. He acknowledged that Daniel's God was the God of gods and the Lord of kings, and he promoted Daniel to one of the highest positions in Babylon. It was a remarkable moment. A young Jewish exile interpreting a Babylonian king's dream, describing a vision of God's sovereignty over all the empires of history, including the one they were both standing in. But Nebuchadnezzar's acknowledgement of God did not mean his behavior changed overnight, and the city around Daniel remained what it was. Daniel chapter 3 takes us to a moment when Daniel himself is apparently absent from the scene. The text does not explain where he is, but his 3 companions, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, were present, and what they faced would test the limits of everything the empire had done to them. Nebuchadnezzar had constructed a massive statue. The text says it was 60 cubits high and 6 cubits wide, made of gold or covered in gold. He assembled every official in his kingdom for a dedication ceremony. And then came the command, when the music plays, bow down and worship the image. Anyone who refuses will be thrown immediately into a furnace of blazing fire. This was not a private test of personal piety. This was a public, political act. Bowing meant loyalty to the Babylonian state religion. Refusing meant not just personal resistance, but a kind of public defiance that no empire tolerates easily. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego refused to bow. Their answer to the king when he gave them a second chance was one of the most remarkable statements of faith in all of Scripture. The text records them saying something like this: "The God we serve is able to deliver us from the blazing furnace and from your hand. But even if he does not, we will not serve your gods or worship the image of gold you have set up. Even if he does not." They were not claiming a guaranteed miracle. They were not bargaining with God for protection. They were saying, our allegiance is not conditional on our survival. The furnace was heated 7 times hotter than usual, the text says. The soldiers who threw the 3 men in were killed by the heat. But when Nebuchadnezzar looked into the furnace, he saw 4 figures walking, unbound, unharmed. And the 4th, he said, looked like a son of the gods. They walked out of the fire without the smell of smoke on their clothes. There are theological debates about who the 4th figure was. The text does not name him explicitly, but what is clear is this. When these 3 men refused to let Babylon's pressure define their allegiance, they were not alone in the fire. And Nebuchadnezzar, again, fell into something like awe. He praised the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. He issued a decree of protection. He promoted the 3 men in the province. But Babylon was still Babylon. The court continued. The pressures continued. And Daniel continued to navigate one of the most volatile, violent, and brilliant environments in the ancient world. The reign of Nebuchadnezzar lasted roughly 43 years, from about 605 to 562 BC. For most of that time, Daniel was inside the Babylonian system, serving in the royal court, rising in influence, watching the king who had ordered his deportation from Jerusalem. And then comes one of the strangest passages in the entire book of Daniel. Chapter 4 records what appears to be a royal proclamation from Nebuchadnezzar himself, written in the first person, describing his own breakdown and restoration. He had another dream, this time of a great tree cut down to a stump, with a band of iron and bronze around it. Daniel interpreted it. The tree was Nebuchadnezzar himself. He would be struck down, driven out from humanity, made to live like an animal in the fields, until he acknowledged that the Most High rules the kingdom of men. The king did not heed the warning. A year later, walking on the roof of his palace and speaking of the greatness of his own power, something happened to him. He was driven from his throne. He ate grass like cattle. His hair grew like eagle's feathers and his nails like bird's claws. He lived this way until, the text says, he lifted his eyes to heaven, and when his reason returned to him, he praised and honored the God of heaven. Historians have debated this account at length. It does not appear in Babylonian royal inscriptions, which were written to celebrate the king's image, not to document his humiliation. Some scholars have suggested possible historical echoes in other ancient sources. Others remain skeptical. Scripture does not require modern secular confirmation to be authoritative, but historians do note the absence of external corroboration for this specific episode. What the text emphasizes is unmistakable. Even the greatest king on earth was ultimately subject to a higher authority. The empire had limits, the king had limits. And when Nebuchadnezzar finally acknowledged that limit, his sanity returned. After Nebuchadnezzar's death in 562 BC, Babylon entered a period of instability. Several kings succeeded each other in relatively rapid succession, some of them violently. Court intrigue, assassination, and shifting alliances defined the years after his reign. By the time we reach the 5th chapter of Daniel, decades have passed. Daniel is now an older man, perhaps in his 70s or 80s. The Babylonian Empire he had entered as a young exile is aging, and a new power is rising from the east. The king on the throne now is Belshazzar. Historically, Belshazzar was the son of Nabonidus, the last actual king of Babylon, who was often absent from the city on campaigns and religious projects. Belshazzar served as co-regent in Babylon. Scripture's description of him as king and his offer to make Daniel third in the kingdom, not second, likely reflects this reality of shared rule that archaeology and ancient records have confirmed. And on the night that Daniel chapter 5 describes, Belshazzar held a feast. It was not just a feast, it was a statement. The Medo-Persian forces under Cyrus were already advancing. Belshazzar's response was to fill his palace with 1,000 guests and drink wine by the light of gold and silver vessels taken from the temple of God in Jerusalem. The very vessels seized decades before. In the middle of the feast, a human hand appeared. It moved across the plaster wall of the banquet hall and wrote 4 words in the flickering lamplight. Mene, Mene, Tekel, Parsin. The king's face changed color. His knees knocked together. The party stopped. No one in the court could read the writing or explain it. The queen mother remembered the old exile from Jerusalem who had interpreted Nebuchadnezzar's dreams. Daniel was brought in. He did not want the king's gifts. He would interpret the writing, but the gifts could go to someone else. And what he said was this: Mene, God has numbered the days of your kingdom and brought it to an end. Tekel, you have been weighed in the scales and found wanting. Parsin, your kingdom is divided and given to the Medes and Persians. That very night, the text tells us, Belshazzar was killed. Outside the walls of Babylon, something had already happened that would reshape the world. The army of Cyrus the Great, king of Persia, had taken the city. Ancient sources, including the Nabonidus Chronicle, a Babylonian administrative text, record that Babylon fell to Cyrus in 539 BC. The city was taken without the kind of siege and destruction that had marked other conquests. Ancient accounts, including the Cyrus Cylinder, present Cyrus as entering Babylon as a liberator rather than a conqueror. A presentation that was partly political, partly genuine reflection of his policy of tolerance toward conquered peoples. Babylon did not burn, its walls did not fall, the city continued to exist. But the Babylonian Empire was over, and the man who had been brought here as a captive young exile was still alive to see it. The book of Daniel chapter 6 takes us into the reign of Darius the Mede, and here the historical picture becomes complicated. Scripture names Darius the Mede as the one who took over Babylon after Cyrus conquered it. But identifying this figure precisely in secular historical records has been a long-standing challenge for scholars. Various proposals have been made that he was a governor, a throne name, a regional ruler, but no single identification has achieved consensus. Scholars who take Daniel as historically reliable have proposed various solutions. Those who are more skeptical see it as a historical difficulty. What the text tells us is that Daniel rose again to prominence under this new administration. He was appointed as one of 3 chief administrators over the entire kingdom. He distinguished himself above all the others, and his enemies could find no grounds for accusation against him, except one, his faithfulness to God. They persuaded the king to issue a decree that for 30 days all prayers and petitions must be directed only to the king, not to any god or man. Violation meant the lion's den. Daniel knew about the decree, and he went home, opened the windows of his upstairs room toward Jerusalem, and prayed 3 times a day. As he had always done, he was observed, he was reported. The king, who valued Daniel, was trapped by his own law, and Daniel was thrown into the pit of lions. The king spent a sleepless night. At dawn he ran to the pit and called out into the darkness, "Daniel, servant of the living God, has your God, whom you serve continually, been able to rescue you from the lions?" And a voice answered. Daniel had been protected. The lions had not touched him. He was brought up from the pit without any wound on him. The text says, because he had trusted in his God. His accusers were thrown into the same pit. And Darius the Mede issued a new decree, that throughout his kingdom, people were to fear and reverence the God of Daniel. The exile from Jerusalem, the captive who had walked through the Ishtar Gate, the young man who had asked only for vegetables and water, the interpreter of dreams, the reader of writing on walls, had survived everything. Babylon could change Daniel's location. It could change his name in the court registry. It could dress him in the robes of Babylonian officials, teach him the stars in the Babylonian sky, fill his days with the language and literature of Mesopotamia. But it could not change his direction. Every day, 3 times a day, he turned toward Jerusalem. That was the resistance. That was the faithfulness. Not a dramatic rebellion, not a public manifesto, just a window, open toward home, and a prayer that would not stop. There is something worth sitting with in the arc of this life. Daniel entered Babylon as a captive with no power, no status, no guarantees of survival. He navigated one of history's most dangerous and seductive environments, a world that rewarded those who adapted and destroyed those who didn't, without either collapsing into it or retreating from it. He served Babylonian kings faithfully. He did excellent work in the empire's administration. He engaged with Babylonian knowledge seriously, and he remained quietly and immovably a servant of the God of Israel. The city that built its gates to declare the supremacy of Marduk is now ruins in the Iraqi desert. Archaeologists still dig through its layers. Tourists walk past reconstructions of its gates in European museums. The empire that demanded Daniel's transformation is studied in history books. Daniel is still read. His prayers are still prayed. His God is still worshipped. The stone the vision described, the one cut without human hands, the one that would crush all the empires of history. That story is still being told by people in nearly every language on earth, including some of the languages spoken by the descendants of Babylon itself. You may find yourself at some point in your life inside your own version of Babylon, a system designed to reshape you, an environment that rewards conformity and punishes distinction, a world that offers you everything if you will only let it rename you. The book of Daniel does not promise that faithfulness is easy or safe or free from cost. It promises something different, that the God who was with Daniel in the court of Nebuchadnezzar, who was with 3 young men in the fire, who was with an old man in a pit of lions, that God is not limited by the empires we find ourselves inside. Babylon thought it had captured Daniel, but the city that tried to hold him is gone, and his name is still spoken.